When a black man is unjustly fined in court by a smug, racist judge, the entire courtroom assumes he's just another easy target. But when the man calmly utters one sentence that changes everything, the judge's face turns pale because he just picked a fight with someone who prosecutes judges for a living. Dalton Ridge, North Carolina, wasn't the kind of town that made headlines, not unless you counted the obituaries, church, fish fries, or the occasional letters to the editor complaining about gas prices or school board decisions. Nestled in a part of the state that seemed allergic to change, it was the kind of place where people still waved American flags from their porches. Judges wore their biases like hidden scars, and outsiders were noticed the moment they crossed the county line. On a humid Monday morning, the courthouse buzzed with low-level energy as residents filed in for traffic citations and misdemeanor charges, their eyes glazed with routine. Judge William Harlan, a man as old as the courthouse pillars and twice as correct in his judgments, sat behind the bench with the self-satisfaction of a man who thought himself untouchable, a relic of an era that should have passed. Harlan had built a reputation not for fairness or wisdom, but for wielding power like a hammer and letting his prejudices shape the law as he saw fit. He was the kind of man who remembered your grandfather's war record but forgot your name if you didn't look like you belonged. He had presided over this town's legal system for over 20 years, and in that time, had rarely been challenged in any meaningful way. That morning, he scanned the day's docket with the kind of disinterest a man has when he already believes he knows how everything will play out. One name, however, pulled his attention for reasons even he didn't fully understand. Mark Talbot. No local address, no defense attorney, no familiar last name or family connections. Just a ticket for reckless driving, issued by Officer Clay Dunham, a man who'd filled Harlan's courtroom more times than he could count. Clay had a knack for pulling over people who didn't quite fit Dalton Ridge's definition of normalist, especially if they were young, black, and driving anything nicer than a used pickup truck. Harlan smirked at the ticket. Another one who wouldn't fight back. He mentally prepared his usual performance, a stern warning, a doubled fine if they resisted, and a long-winded moral lesson about responsibility and respecting the law. Game was set. But when Marcus entered the courtroom, everything tilted slightly off its axis. He walked in not slouched or defiant, but calm, composed, and almost regal in his bearing. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a black leather briefcase in hand, he looked more like a visiting attorney than a man accused of a traffic offense. People in the gallery looked up, surprised. The air shifted. He carried himself with a kind of restrained authority that didn't beg for respect, it commanded it without effort. Harlan's eyes narrowed. This wasn't going to be routine. Name? The judge barked, hoping to establish dominance early. Marcus Talbot, Your Honor, came the smooth, clear reply. Present. Harlan leaned forward. You're here for a reckless driving citation. Officer Dunham clocked you doing 65 in a 35. That's not just speeding, it's reckless. Plead guilty and pay the fine, or we can waste everyone's time with a trial you won't win. Marcus blinked once. Slowly, with all due respect, Your Honor, I intend to contest the citation. A few murmurs rose from the benches behind him. Harlan's eyes lit up with condescension. Oh, and what makes you think you'll win against the sworn testimony of a decorated officer? I have dashcam footage, Marcus replied evenly. It shows I was traveling at 39 miles per hour. The judge's fingers drummed on the bench. Footage doesn't mean much, unless I say it does. Officer Dunham is a good man. His word carries weight, even when it contradicts evidence. Marcus asked. His tone wasn't confrontational, just direct, clear, the kind of clarity that makes men like Harlan deeply uncomfortable. Watch your tone, the judge growled. I don't tolerate disrespect in my courtroom. Disrespect? Marcus asked. Or dissent? Harlan's jaw tightened. You watch yourself, boy. The word dropped like a lead weight. There was a pause, a collective intake of breath from the courtroom. Everyone heard it. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even Dunham, standing in the corner, looked momentarily uneasy. Marcus didn't flinch. He set his briefcase down on the table in front of him, opened it, and pulled out a thin black folder. Let the record show that Your Honor has just used a racial slur in open court, he said, and that he has prejudged the case before reviewing evidence. What are you implying? Harlan snapped. That this court is racist. I'm not implying, Marcus said. I'm stating I am Marcus Talbot, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina. I specialize in public corruption and civil rights violations. I came here today undercover after a series of complaints were filed against this court, particularly regarding Officer Dunham and your courtroom conduct. The room exploded, not literally, but in gasps, in shock, in the wide eyes of people who'd never seen a judge speechless. Harlan blinked like he'd been slapped. You can't be serious. Marcus stepped forward. I'm wearing a microphone. Everything said in this courtroom today has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence. That includes your threat to double my fine for exercising my right to contest a charge, and your use of a racial slur from the bench. Harlan fumbled for his gavel. This is entrapment. You're trying to bait me. No, Marcus replied. I was investigating you, and unfortunately, you didn't need bait. You delivered all of this on your own. Dunham took a step back. The judge looked at him, as if pleading for some kind of lifeline. But Dunham knew better. He'd seen the signs for months: more complaints, more heat from above. Now it had all boiled over. This court is corrupt, Marcus continued, voice rising just enough to be heard clearly. It has operated under a veil of racism and unchecked power for too long. The Department of Justice will be pursuing a full investigation, effective immediately. I demand you recuse yourself from this case, he added. You've demonstrated racial bias, judicial misconduct, and an unwillingness to accept evidence. You can't do this, Harlan said, his voice faltering. You don't have the authority I do, Marcus said. And I'm not here alone. There are 2 DOJ investigators waiting outside the courtroom, ready to begin interviews. Just then, the doors opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in, flashing badges. The courtroom gallery sat in stunned silence, watching decades of unchecked authority unravel in real time. Harlan sagged back in his chair, defeated. This can't be happening, he muttered. It is, Marcus said, collecting his folder. And it's been happening for a long time. Today, it just finally got caught. The bailiff didn't move. The clerk didn't speak. Officer Dunham slowly stepped out of the room, his face pale. The judge's gavel, once the loudest sound in the courthouse, now lay useless beside his shaking hand. Justice, long denied in Dalton Ridge, had finally begun to arrive. The courthouse in Dalton Ridge had never felt quieter. Even as the crowd dispersed in stunned silence, following the courtroom bombshell, word traveled fast in small towns, and within an hour, whispers turned into waves. From diners to barber shops, to church parking lots, people repeated variations of the same phrase. Judge Harlan's done for. In the days that followed, the courthouse, once a symbol of unchecked authority, became the epicenter of scrutiny. Judge William Harlan, once feared and untouchable, now found himself buried under a deluge of legal summons, ethics complaints, and a DOJ probe that moved with calculated precision. But for Marcus Talbot, the work had only just begun. The undercover operation had been in motion for months, sparked by a pattern of racial profiling and judicial abuse in rural counties like Dalton Ridge. While the courtroom confrontation had revealed the tip of the corruption, Marcus knew that beneath the surface, far more rot existed. As an assistant U.S. attorney, Marcus had made a name for himself holding powerful men accountable: mayors who siphoned funds, sheriffs who brutalized inmates, even judges who manipulated dockets for personal gain. But this assignment was personal. His father, a Vietnam veteran and former civil rights attorney, had once driven through Dalton Ridge 20 years earlier and been unlawfully arrested for loitering. Marcus had never forgotten that story, told to him over Sunday dinners and family holidays. His father's arrest never made headlines, but it left a scar that shaped Marcus's career. Now, standing on the same soil where his father was once, handcuffed and humiliated, Marcus vowed to clean out every last corner of injustice. Within 48 hours of the courtroom incident, Judge Harlan was placed on administrative leave pending an ethics review. But that wasn't enough for Marcus. He and the DOJ team opened a formal investigation into the entire judicial circuit. They dug into decades of rulings, examining sentencing discrepancies, racial disparities in fines, and complaints that had mysteriously gone missing. They interviewed former clerks, defense attorneys, and even retired police officers who, now, unburdened by fear, spoke of Harlan's pattern of favoritism and racial bias. One clerk revealed how Harlan had ordered her to lose evidence files tied to black defendants. Another attorney spoke of being silenced in court when he raised objections to blatantly unconstitutional remarks. Each testimony painted the same picture: a courtroom turned kingdom, with Harlan sitting on a crooked throne. But Marcus didn't stop at the judge. Officer Clay Dunham, whose citation started this entire case, quickly became a person of interest. His body cam footage from multiple stops mysteriously disappeared or had gaps. Civilian complaints against him were found to be mysteriously resolved without proper documentation. Digging into his record, Marcus uncovered dozens of traffic stops targeting black drivers, nearly all of them fined heavily, with most choosing to pay rather than fight an unfair system. One case stood out: a single black mother fined $900 for reckless endangerment. After rolling through a stop sign while taking her asthmatic daughter to the ER, she lost her license and eventually her job. She cried during her interview. With Marcus, not out of fear but from disbelief that someone was finally listening. As evidence mounted, the DOJ held a town hall meeting at the community center. Residents packed the room, many unsure if this was real or another empty promise. But when Marcus stood at the podium and introduced himself not as a lawyer from Washington, but as someone who had lived the same injustices, they listened. Justice isn't just about punishment, he said, looking directly into the eyes of the townspeople. It's about restoration, about restoring faith in the law and in each other. What happened in that courtroom is unacceptable, and we won't stop until everyone responsible is held accountable. Cheers broke out. People stood, a few wept. For many in Dalton Ridge's black community, it was the first time they'd felt seen by the very system that had long ignored them. Harlan, holed up in his Victorian-style home on Ridgeview Lane, watched the news unfold with a growing sense of dread. He called in Favor's old political friends, local attorneys, but few answered. Those who did quickly distanced themselves. The town had begun to shift, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of history. He even tried to reach out to Marcus directly, hoping to cut a deal, but Marcus declined. "There's no deal that clears what you've done," he said in a recorded response. "You didn't just fail as a judge, you weaponized the law to punish those who challenged you. Now it's your turn to answer for that." Meanwhile, the DOJ issued subpoenas for all court communications over the past 10 years. The audit uncovered manipulated court schedules, deliberate delays for minority defendants, and pressure on court-appointed attorneys to encourage guilty pleas. Marcus was particularly disturbed by one discovery: a secret email exchange between Harlan and Dunham, referring to black drivers as easy finds and joking about who could write more tickets before noon. The emails, once authenticated, sealed Harlan's fate. The DOJ prepared a formal indictment for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. Officer Dunham was suspended without pay and faced a separate federal investigation for falsifying reports. As the hammer of justice began to fall, Marcus continued working. He returned to the courthouse, now under interim leadership, to meet with local activists and community leaders. He helped establish a local civilian legal aid council to ensure residents could contest charges without fear or financial ruin. He arranged for expungements and reviews of previous convictions that had been unfairly decided under Harlan's oversight. One afternoon, as he was reviewing files in what used to be Harlan's chambers, Marcus found a framed quote on the wall: "The law is whatever the judge says it is." He stared at it for a long moment, then carefully took it down and laid it face down on the floor. Justice was not the word of a single man. It was a collective promise. And finally, in Dalton Ridge, that promise was being honored. But perhaps the most poignant moment came a week later, when Marcus visited the local high school to speak at a student assembly. The principal, a quiet man with silver hair, introduced Marcus with reverence. "Students," he said, "this is what courage looks like. A man who saw wrong and chose to make it right." Marcus stepped to the microphone. The auditorium fell silent. He looked out over hundreds of young faces, black, white, and every shade between, and he said, "Some people wear power like a weapon. But real power, true justice, protects, it lifts, and it listens. Never forget that your voice can be the beginning of change." Mine was. As he left the stage, a group of students surrounded him, asking questions, shaking his hand, thanking him. One young girl, maybe 16, whispered, "My brother's case got dropped because of you." "Thank you." Marcus smiled gently. "Thank your brother." He had the strength to stand up. "I just helped carry his voice." Back in Washington, his supervisors commended his work, calling it one of the most effective civil rights investigations in recent state history. But Marcus didn't care for applause. He cared for outcomes. For families made whole, for wrongs made right. He sat alone one evening, on a park bench outside the Dalton Ridge courthouse, watching the sunset melt across the building's facade. The same courthouse that once represented fear now stood as a beacon of reform. Justice had come not with rage, but with resolve. And it started, as it often does, with one man refusing to be silenced. The winds of change that swept through Dalton Ridge did not die down in the weeks following the exposure of Judge Harlan and Officer Dunham. Instead, they roared louder, transforming from a local reckoning into a national story that ignited conversations far beyond the county's borders. News vans began appearing in front of the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters documented the fall of a once invincible judge and the quiet strength of the federal prosecutor, who brought him down. National outlets carried headlines like "Small Town Big Reckoning" and "Federal Prosecutor Exposes Deep-Rooted Racism in Rural Court." In homes, schools, churches, and city halls across the country, Marcus Talbot's name became a symbol, not just of justice, but of resilience, of proof that the law could serve the people rather than silence them. But for Marcus, fame was never the goal. It was a byproduct, an inconvenient spotlight he wore with humility. While networks requested interviews and editorial boards praised his courage, Marcus remained focused on the real mission: systemic change. The DOJ granted him expanded authority to lead a full-scale civil rights task force across multiple southern counties, prioritizing rural jurisdictions with histories of discriminatory legal practices. He assembled a diverse team: lawyers, civil rights historians, data analysts, and community advocates, men and women who understood not just statutes, but stories, who knew that numbers alone didn't carry the weight of justice unless they echoed the lived experiences of the marginalized. With Dalton Ridge as the pilot program, Marcus and his team introduced sweeping reforms: a racial bias audit of law enforcement activity, mandatory body cam implementation, a rotating panel of oversight judges from outside jurisdictions, and a newly established civilian board that reviewed all complaints against officers and judges. They also launched a public awareness campaign titled Know Your Rights, Own Your Voice, offering free legal education, workshops in churches, schools, and community centers. One such workshop drew over 300 residents, more than half the town. Marcus stood at the front of a church auditorium, chalk in hand, walking people through traffic stop protocols, court appeal processes, and how to file complaints that wouldn't vanish into the void. If you know the rules, he said, they can't use them to break you. The impact was immediate. Across the county, people began showing up to court with confidence, asking questions, requesting evidence, and challenging citations with facts instead of fear. Officers became noticeably more professional in their interactions, aware that the days of unchecked authority were over. Judges, many of whom had grown complacent, now operated under the watchful eye of federal oversight. Meanwhile, the cases Marcus had personally reviewed, over 200 in total, began seeing reversals, expungements, and in some cases, compensation for wrongful fines and convictions. Among those freed from unjust punishment was an elderly black man named Leonard Fry, convicted 10 years earlier of resisting arrest after asking why he'd been pulled over. Leonard had served 18 months and lost his home in the process. When Marcus met him, Leonard gripped his hand with tearful gratitude and said, "They tried to bury me, but you dug me out." And then there was Jasmine Burke, the single mother, fined nearly $1,000 by Officer Dunham for rushing her daughter to the ER. Marcus not only had her fines reversed but also arranged pro bono legal support to help her get her license reinstated and her job back. These stories were more than victories, they were reparations, moments of long overdue restoration. But perhaps the most emotional moment came when Marcus returned to Washington to testify before a congressional subcommittee on judicial reform. Senators, staffers, and civil rights leaders filled the room, prepared to hear from the man whose work in a forgotten town had reignited a national debate on judicial ethics and racial justice. As Marcus took his seat behind the microphone, the room fell quiet. "In Dalton Ridge," he began, "justice had a name, but not a face. It wore a robe, but not integrity. It wielded authority, but not accountability. What we found was not just misconduct, it was the normalization of injustice. It was silence, weaponized by fear. But we changed that, and we can do it again." His testimony lasted 45 minutes, but the impact echoed for weeks. Lawmakers introduced bipartisan legislation called the Talbot Act, Transparency and Accountability. In local bench oversight and trials, a bill mandating judicial audits in rural court systems, independent complaint boards, and regular ethics training for judges. Marcus, though proud, remained grounded. Back in Dalton Ridge, life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The courthouse, now under the leadership of an interim judge selected from a neutral county, saw its first day of operations without protest or fear. A memorial plaque was placed in the foyer, not to honor a man, but a moment. It read, "In this courthouse, the law was challenged, and the truth prevailed." Marcus stood before it one afternoon, alone, fingers grazing the engraved letters. It wasn't about legacy, it was about light in dark places. He thought of his father then, who passed away before he could see this moment, who had told his son, time and time again, "Change doesn't come easy, son, but when it does, let it stay." Marcus let that truth settle in his chest. Change had come, and it was going to stay. A week later, as he packed his belongings from the temporary office he'd used during the investigation, a knock came at the door. It was Sarah Linden, the young assistant who'd helped him sort thousands of records and whose own brother had been railroaded by Harlan years ago. "They want you to stay," she said, holding a letter from the town council. "They want you to serve as special legal advisor, permanently help guide the reforms, maybe even help appoint the next full-time judge." Marcus looked at the letter, then at Sarah. "I never planned to stay," he said honestly. "This wasn't supposed to be a homecoming." "Maybe it wasn't," she said, "but maybe it's becoming one." He thought about it. The work was far from done. The wounds of injustice took more than indictments to heal. But in a town that had once shunned men like him, the people were now asking him to help shape their future. That was more than justice, it was redemption. So Marcus stayed, not forever, but long enough. Long enough to help rebuild what had been broken, to ensure that no one else would ever fear the courtroom steps or the sound of a judge's gavel. He mentored young lawyers, established scholarships for local students pursuing law, and held monthly forums where the public could ask questions about the justice system. Slowly, surely, the courthouse transformed from a place of punishment to a pillar of empowerment. And on the day the town finally appointed a new judge, a black woman named Justice Morgan, born and raised to towns over, Marcus stood at the back of the courtroom, hands clasped, watching as the gavel passed from tyranny to hope. Justice now had a new face, and this time, it looked like everyone.